Have you ever had that feeling where something is just off? That creeping sensation that crawls up your spine when you're alone in a strange place? I never used to believe in ghosts or haunted houses. I was the skeptic who'd roll my eyes at ghost stories. But after what happened last October in that old Victorian on Maple Street, I need you to hear my story. Because what I experienced changed everything I thought I knew about reality, and I need to know if anyone else has seen what I've seen. So, get comfortable, maybe keep a light on, and listen closely. Because the most terrifying part, I'm still not entirely sure I've escaped. The story begins now. I never expected to inherit a house from someone I'd never met. But there I was, standing in my attorney's office, staring down at the deed with my name on it. Sarah Mitchell. Suddenly, the owner of a 19th century Victorian in a small town called Wisteria Falls. Your great-aunt Edith wanted you to have it, Mr. Peterson explained, adjusting his glasses. She had no children of her own. I frowned. But I never knew I had a great-aunt Edith. Family estrangement is more common than you'd think. I was at a crossroads, recently laid off from my design job in Boston, fresh out of a relationship that ended with Jason taking the apartment and the cat. I had been crashing on my friend's couch for weeks. A house, any house, seemed like a gift from the universe. What I would discover later through town gossip was that Edith had become a recluse. Some neighbors claimed they hadn't seen her leave the house in over a decade. The drive to Wisteria Falls took nearly 4 hours. The town itself appeared almost suddenly. Storefronts that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1950s. I stopped at a local diner to ask directions to Maple Street. The waitress, a woman named Darlene, paused when I mentioned the address. "The Mitchell place?" she asked, her pencil hovering. "You're headed to the Mitchell place?" "Yes, I inherited it from my great-aunt. I'm Sarah Mitchell." Darlene's expression shifted subtly. "Well, honey, isn't that something?" She wrote down directions. "It's about a mile up that way, past the old cemetery, big Victorian, can't miss it." She hesitated. "Will you be staying long?" "I'm not sure yet." She nodded slowly. "Well, welcome to Wisteria Falls. We don't get many newcomers." I thanked her, unable to shake the feeling that Darlene had wanted to say something more. Maple Street curved up a gentle hill away from the town center. And then I saw it, sitting alone at the very end, partially obscured by massive oak trees. My house. 3 stories of faded grandeur with a wraparound porch, ornate trim, and a widow's walk at the very top. In its day, it must have been the crown jewel of the neighborhood. Now, it had an air of elegant decay. The key felt heavy in my hand as I approached the front door. It turned with surprising ease, and the door swung inward with a resonant creak. "Hello?" I called out automatically, then felt foolish. Who did I expect to answer? The air inside carried the scent of old books, furniture polish, and something else. Something floral but medicinal. Lavender, maybe. The entryway opened to a grand staircase. To the right was a formal dining room. To the left, a sitting room with furniture draped in white sheets, ghostly forms in the dim light. I spent that first afternoon exploring. The house was fully furnished, filled with antiques that probably held significant value. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs. I chose what appeared to be a guest room for myself, smaller and less imposing than the master bedroom. By evening, I had cleared the sheets from the furniture and made my temporary bedroom habitable. As I was making dinner, I heard it for the first time, a soft thump from somewhere upstairs like a book falling from a shelf. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. "Old houses make noises," I said aloud. "It's settling," but as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not exactly a presence, more an awareness, like the house itself knew I was there. That night, I slept fitfully. Around 3 a.m., I jolted awake, certain I'd heard footsteps in the hallway, a distinct cadence of slow, dragging steps. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering. The steps paused outside my door. Then, a whisper, so faint I might have imagined it. "Sarah." I convinced myself the voice had been part of a dream. The next day, I found a photo album in the library and spent an hour looking through black and white photographs. In one, a young woman stood in front of the house. On the back, in faded pencil, Edith, a 943. She had my eyes. While replacing the album, I noticed a small door in the library wall, partially hidden behind a standing globe. It was about 4 feet high with an old-fashioned latch. I tried it. Locked. That evening, I walked into town for dinner, hoping to learn more about my great-aunt. "Did you know my Aunt Edith?" I asked Darlene. Her smile tightened. Everyone knew Edith. She was a character. "What do you mean?" Darlene lowered her voice. "Some folks said she was practicing witchcraft up there. Others thought she'd lost her mind. Truth is, nobody really knew because she didn't let anyone in. Not for years." Walking back as twilight settled, I felt a distinct unease growing with each step toward the house. In the fading light, its silhouette seemed more ominous against the darkening sky. As I approached the front gate, I stopped abruptly. There was a light on in a third-floor window. A window I hadn't even found a room for during my explorations. And silhouetted against the curtain was what appeared to be the figure of a woman, standing perfectly still, looking down at me. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The light, too. I nearly turned around, nearly walked back to town to find a hotel, but pride stopped me. This was my house now. Taking a deep breath, I marched up the path and let myself in, flipping on lights as I went. Nothing seemed disturbed, except there was a book on the floor in the library. A leather-bound journal I didn't remember seeing before. It lay open, its pages fluttering slightly, though there was no breeze. I approached it cautiously. The date at the top read April 17th, 1952. It's getting stronger, the presence in the walls. I hear it moving at night, scratching, whispering. Mother says I'm imagining things, but I know what I hear, something wants to come through. I closed the journal with shaking hands. This had to be Edith's diary, but who had left it open on the floor? That night, the noises were unmistakable. Footsteps, creaking floorboards, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor above my room. And underneath it all, a soft, persistent scratching from somewhere inside the walls. I lay awake until dawn, clutching my phone, one finger hovering over the emergency call button. By my 5th day in the house, I had established a routine. During daylight hours, I cleaned and made small repairs. The nights were different. The unexplained noises continued, sometimes subtle, sometimes startlingly loud. Twice more I heard my name whispered in the darkness. I couldn't explain the diary. Each morning, it appeared in a different place, on the kitchen table, the stairs, the windowsill in my bedroom, always open to a new page, as if someone wanted me to read Edith's increasingly disturbing entries. November 3rd, 1953. I've sealed the door in the library. What's on the other side must stay there. The key is hidden where only a Mitchell can find it. January 9th, 1954. Mother doesn't believe me, even after what happened to Thomas. She says it was an accident. It wasn't. I saw what pulled him into the darkness. March 22nd, 1954. I can't leave now. I am the guardian. When I'm gone, another must take my place. Blood calls to blood. I became obsessed with the small door in the library. What was on the other side? And what had Edith meant about a key only a Mitchell can find? I searched the library methodically, checking books for hollow centers, tapping walls for hidden compartments. Nothing. I found a photograph tucked inside an old copy of Jane Eyre, a faded Polaroid showing a young man standing on the Widow's Walk. On the back, Thomas, Summer 1953. Before what? On my 8th night in the house, I was awakened by a soft, melancholy humming coming from somewhere above me. A woman's voice, singing a tune I almost recognized. Instead of hiding, I got up and followed the sound. It led me upstairs, past the second-floor bedrooms, to a narrow door I had assumed was a linen closet. Now it stood slightly ajar, revealing a steep staircase beyond. The humming grew louder as I climbed the stairs. At the top was another door leading out onto the widow's walk, the railed platform at the very top of the house. The night air was cold as I stepped outside. The humming had stopped. I was alone under a canopy of stars, with the sleeping town spread out below me. Or not quite alone. In the far corner of the platform stood a rocking chair I hadn't noticed before. It moved slightly in the night breeze. Or perhaps something else had just vacated it. I approached slowly, my light revealing a small object on the seat. A key, antique brass with an intricate pattern that matched the one on the front door key. As I reached for it, the chair suddenly rocked violently as if pushed by invisible hands. I stumbled back with a cry, nearly falling against the railing. Heart pounding, I snatched up the key and retreated to the door. As I reached for the handle, the humming resumed. Right behind me now, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The key, clutched in my trembling hand, had to be what Edith had mentioned. The key only a Mitchell can find. But why lead me to it now? The answer came the next morning, when I found the diary open on the kitchen table. April 1st, 1955. It knows I've contained it. It's angry. It tries to trick me with Thomas's voice, with Mother's face in the mirrors. I must be strong. The door must remain sealed until someone stronger comes. The bloodline continues. She will come. She, me? With daylight streaming through the windows, I had two choices. Pack my bags and leave, or use the key. I chose the latter. The key fit perfectly into the lock of the small door in the library. It turned with a heavy click that seemed to reverberate through the house. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway that shouldn't logically exist given the house's layout. It extended into darkness, the walls close on either side. I hesitated, then turned on my phone's flashlight and ducked into the passage. After about 20 feet, the passage widened into a small circular room with a high, domed ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves holding dozens of glass jars. A wooden table stood in the center, covered with candle wax, open books, and dried flowers. On the far wall hung a large, tarnished mirror in an ornate frame. As my light fell upon it, I gasped. Instead of my reflection, the glass showed only swirling darkness, like smoke trapped behind glass. I approached cautiously. The darkness in the mirror seemed to move with purpose, churning as I drew nearer. And then, from within that darkness, a face began to form. Not mine, but that of an elderly woman with my eyes, her expression one of urgency and fear. Edith. Her lips moved, but I heard nothing. Suddenly, her image vanished, replaced by that swirling darkness. Only now, it seemed to be pushing against the glass from the other side, bulging outward as if testing its prison. A crack appeared in the mirror's surface, spreading slowly from corner to corner. I backed away, bumping into the table and sending several items clattering to the floor. Among them was a small, leather-bound book different from the diary I'd been finding. It fell open to a page covered in strange symbols and what looked like instructions. As the mirror continued to crack, I snatched up the book and fled, slamming the small door shut behind me and locking it. That night, the house was more active than ever. Every floorboard seemed to creak with unseen footsteps. Doors opened and closed on their own. The temperature fluctuated wildly. I sat up in bed, frantically paging through the book I'd taken from the hidden room. Much of it was written in a language I didn't recognize. but scattered throughout were entries in English in Edith's handwriting. The mirror is a door. The door is a mirror. What is reflected cannot pass through unless invited. Blood binds. Blood releases. Thomas invited it in. Thomas paid the price. I contained it, but cannot destroy it. The binding weakens with time. It must be renewed. When I am gone, it will seek another. A Mitchell must stand guard. Always. As I read these cryptic notes, a familiar sound reached my ears, the humming from above. Only now a man's voice had joined it, the two weaving together in a haunting duet. And beneath them both, another sound. A rhythmic scratching from inside the walls, growing louder, more insistent, as if dozens of invisible hands were clawing their way toward me. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I studied the book, searching for answers about what Edith had been guarding against and what she expected me to do. By dawn, I had pieced together a theory. The mirror in the hidden room was some kind of portal. Something had come through it decades ago, when Thomas had somehow invited it in. Edith had trapped whatever it was, binding it to the mirror through a ritual involving her blood, Mitchell blood. But the binding required periodic renewal, and with Edith's death, it was weakening. And somehow, the house had passed to me because I was next in the bloodline. I was expected to take up Edith's role as guardian. The thought was absurd, yet I couldn't deny my own experiences. Something was in this house with me, something that knew my name and was growing stronger. I decided to return to the hidden room, examine the mirror more carefully, and see if there were clues I had missed. The mirror had changed. The crack had spread across its entire surface, creating a web-like pattern. And behind the glass, the darkness churned more violently, pressing against its prison. I approached cautiously, the book clutched in my hands. One passage had stood out. The seal must be renewed with Mitchell blood freely given under the full moon. 3 drops on the glass, 3 on the frame, while speaking the words of binding. The words themselves were written in that unfamiliar language, phonetically transcribed in Edith's neat hand. As I stood before the mirror, gathering my courage, the darkness behind the glass suddenly stilled. Then, slowly, it began to take shape. A man's face formed in the glass. Young, handsome, with Mitchell eyes. "Thomas?" I whispered. His lips moved. "Don't trust it. Don't trust what you see." The image rippled, then changed to a perfect reflection of myself. Only wrong somehow. My reflection smiled when I did not, tilted its head when I remained still. "Sarah?" The voice came from behind me, a perfect mimicry of my own. "Let me out, Sarah. Let me help you understand." I whirled around, but the room was empty. When I turned back, my false reflection was pressing its hands against the glass from the other side, the cracks widening around its touch. "Blood binds," it said, its voice a discordant version of my own. "Blood releases. You know what to do, Sarah Mitchell." A sharp pain lanced through my palm. I looked down to find I had unconsciously closed my hand around a small dagger with symbols etched into the blade. Blood, my blood, trickled from a shallow cut. The false reflection's eyes widened with hunger, its smile growing inhumanly wide. "Yes," it hissed. "Give your blood. Release me. It's your purpose, your inheritance." But something in its eagerness gave me pause. Edith's notes specified blood freely given to strengthen the binding, not to release whatever was trapped. It was trying to trick me, just as it had likely tricked Thomas. I took a step back. "No, I don't think that's how this works." The thing in the mirror shrieked, a sound like glass shattering and wind howling simultaneously. Its face contorted until it was no longer human. "You will free me," it roared, its voice shaking dust from the ceiling. "Or I will take what is mine." The mirror bulged outward impossibly, the cracks widening. A coldness filled the room, so intense it burned my lungs. The jars on the shelves began to rattle, some falling and shattering. I had seconds to decide, flee or confront this thing as Edith had. I felt a strange calm descend over me, a certainty. This was why the house had passed to me. I was a Mitchell. This was my inheritance, my responsibility. With deliberate movements, I stepped forward and pressed my bleeding palm against the mirror's surface. The glass was ice cold. I began to recite the words from the book, stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables but pushing through, my voice growing stronger. The thing in the mirror writhed and screeched, its form dissolving back into darkness. The cracks in the glass began to seal themselves under my bloodied hand. As I spoke the final words, a shock wave seemed to emanate from the mirror, throwing me backward against the table. Then silence. Stillness. I picked myself up slowly. The mirror hung innocuously on the wall, its surface whole again, reflecting nothing but the ordinary room and my own face. Had it worked? Was the binding renewed? A sense of lightness filled the room, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The lavender scent returned, clean and calming now. That night, for the first time since my arrival, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no scratching in the walls. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, and the diary lay open on my nightstand. The page displayed a new entry, in handwriting that matched Edith's but looked fresher, the ink barely dry. October 15th, 2023. The Guardian changes. The binding holds. Until the next full moon, we have peace. The next full moon. 1 month. I had bought myself 1 month before I would need to renew the binding again. 3 days before the full moon, the house began to stir again. Subtle at first. A book misplaced, a door I'd closed, standing open, then more overt. The scratching in the walls, the humming from above. That evening, I heard the small door in the library unlocking and opening, though the key remained on the chain around my neck. I rushed downstairs to find the passage standing open, a faint blue light emanating from the hidden room. I entered. The mirror pulsed with blue light, its surface rippling like water, and reflected in it was not the room, but what appeared to be a garden under a night sky filled with impossible stars. A figure stood in this garden, a young man in clothing from another era. As if sensing my presence, he turned. Thomas. The same face I had glimpsed before. "You're not really Thomas," I said. "I am, and I am not," he replied, his voice sounding distant. "What you see is memory, impression, echo. Part of what was Thomas Mitchell remains here, trapped with what he accidentally freed. What did he free? What are you? Something old. Something that existed between worlds before this house, before this town. It found a thin place here, a weakness between realities. The mirror was built to seal it. The Mitchells became its wardens. And Thomas broke the seal?" I asked. He was curious. He thought he could communicate with what was beyond. It spoke to him for months in dreams and whispers, promised knowledge, power, truth, and I believed it. What happened to you? I let it in, just a little, I thought. Just enough to learn. His form flickered. It used me to try to break through completely. Edith stopped it, contained it again, but not before part of me was trapped here with it. And now it wants me to free it, I said, using my blood. Yes, Mitchell blood binds, Mitchell blood releases. Don't trust what you see, Sarah, don't trust what you hear. Even this, even me. His figure dissolved into blue light. The mirror's surface returned to darkness, though the cracks I had sealed were beginning to reappear. I retreated, locking the small door behind me. But as I turned to leave the library, I found I wasn't alone. An elderly woman stood by the fireplace, straight-backed, with sharp eyes that matched my own. Edith. "You've done well so far, Sarah," she said. "Better than I expected." "Are you real?" I asked, though I knew the answer. The entity was trying a new approach. The binding ritual is a burden," she continued, "a prison sentence passed down through our family." "To protect the world from what's in the mirror," I said. Her expression hardened. "That's only half the truth. What's in the mirror was once worshipped as a god. It granted our ancestors knowledge, power, protection. The binding doesn't just keep it contained, it keeps it connected to our family. We are its keepers, yes, but also its beneficiaries." "What are you saying?" "There's another way. A covenant rather than a prison. With the right words, your blood could forge a new relationship with what's beyond the mirror, one of mutual benefit." "Like what happened with Thomas?" I asked pointedly. "Thomas was careless. You would be neither." She mentioned my mother, Elizabeth, who had refused to accept her heritage. I had never told anyone in town my mother's name. "Think about it, Sarah. You've felt it already, the connection to this house. The binding doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a partnership." She extended a hand toward me. "I can show you the true ritual." I stared at the outstretched hand, tempted. What if there was some truth here? But I remembered Thomas's warning. Don't trust what you see. Don't trust what you hear. I stepped back. "No, I'll perform the ritual as written in Edith's book. Nothing more, nothing less." "Not." Edith's face transformed in an instant, rage replacing the grandmotherly concern. The air around her shimmered, her form revealing something else beneath, something with too many angles, too many eyes. "Fool!" The voice was no longer Edith's. "You will free me or join me." The apparition lunged toward me. I stumbled backward as objects began to fly from the shelves, a whirlwind swirling around the furious entity. I ran upstairs as the house shook around me, pictures falling, cracks spreading across the ceiling. On the night of the full moon, I was ready. I entered the hidden room as the moon rose, casting silvery light through a small window in the ceiling. The mirror waited, its surface a web of fine cracks, the darkness behind it pulsing like a heartbeat. I had brought what I needed. A silver bowl, the dagger, dried lavender. I had memorized the ritual. As I arranged these items, the mirror's surface rippled, and from its depths, shapes began to form. A kaleidoscope of temptations and fears. My mother, arms outstretched. Scenes from a life I could have. Success, wealth, recognition. Then darker visions. The world in flames, a darkness spreading. A vision of myself, aged and alone, still bound to this house. I closed my eyes, shut out the visions, and began the ritual. I pricked my palm with the dagger, letting 3 drops of blood fall into the silver bowl. With each mark I drew on the mirror's frame, the cracks in the glass began to seal, the darkness receding. "Blood binds," I said, completing the ritual. "I, Sarah Mitchell, renew the covenant of containment, for one turning of the seasons until the next full moon of October." A pulse of energy emanated from the mirror, washing over me like a wave. The air cleared, lightened, it was done. I had renewed the binding. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small journal tucked between 2 jars on a high shelf. Inside were entries in Edith's handwriting, the most recent dated just before her death. September 2nd, 2023. The entity grows stronger with each cycle. Soon, a binding alone may not be enough. Sarah must discover what I discovered. There is another way, not release, not mere containment, but transformation. I leave this final journal where only one who has completed a binding will think to look. If you are reading this, Sarah, know that I have watched over you from afar all your life. The Mitchell legacy is not merely one of duty, but of power and protection. The attic. Go to the attic when you are ready for the next step. The real work begins after the first binding. This hadn't been left by the entity. This had been hidden. Meant only for me, after I had proven myself. There was more to my heritage than I had understood, and somewhere in the attic were answers Edith had left specifically for me. I had a month until the next full moon. A month to explore the attic and discover what Edith meant by transformation. A month to decide if I would remain in Wisteria Falls, accept this unexpected inheritance of purpose. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I caught a glimpse of movement in a hallway mirror. For an instant, I saw an elderly woman with my eyes, nodding in approval before the reflection returned to normal. Edith. The real Edith this time, I somehow knew. I wasn't alone in this house. I never had been. As I sit here recording this story months later, I still haven't fully unraveled all the secrets of the Mitchell house. Each full moon brings its own challenges, its own revelations. There's power in this position, in this bloodline, that I'm only beginning to comprehend. The mirror doesn't just hold something back. It holds something open, a connection to elsewhere. I've made this house my own now. People still whisper about the Mitchell place and the strange woman who lives there alone, but I don't mind. I've discovered others like me, other families with their own inherited duties, their own bindings and bargains with things beyond normal understanding. We help each other. We keep the world turning in its familiar orbit, blissfully unaware of how close it sometimes comes to spinning off its axis. But I often wonder, am I containing something dangerous, or is something containing me? Am I the jailer, or just another kind of prisoner? If you're listening to this, perhaps you've had your own brushes with the inexplicable. Perhaps you felt that crawling sensation up your spine when alone in a strange place, sensed eyes watching from empty rooms, heard your name whispered by voices that shouldn't exist. You're not imagining things. The world is stranger than most people allow themselves to perceive. The boundaries are thinner than we pretend. I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? A house that felt alive? A reflection that wasn't quite right? Tell me your story. I believe you. And if you ever find yourself in a small New England town called Wisteria Falls, look for the Victorian at the end of Maple Street. The Mitchell house. My house. I'm always looking for others who understand. Just be sure to visit before dark. And whatever you do, don't look too long into any mirrors you might find inside. Some reflections are doors, and some doors open both ways. Sleep well. Pleasant dreams. I'll see you in the next story. Story number 2. Have you ever felt that sensation in the woods? The prickling on the back of your neck. The quiet whisper that tells you something is watching from behind the trees. The strange feeling that the forest isn't just trees and dirt, but something alive, aware, and ancient. If you felt this, you might have encountered what Native American tribes in the Northeast have feared for centuries, the Pukwudgies. Tonight's story might explain those unexplained experiences you've had while hiking, the strange sounds when camping, the items that mysteriously disappeared from your backpack, the inexplicable desire to wander off trail despite your better judgment. Before we begin, I'd love to know if you've ever experienced anything strange in the woods. Share your experiences in the comments below. And if tonight's tale resonates with you, please consider subscribing to join our community of listeners who appreciate these forgotten corners of American folklore. Now, get comfortable, dim your lights, and prepare to enter the Watchful Woods. The story begins. I never believed in monsters until I moved to western Massachusetts. There's something different about the forests here compared to the manicured national parks I visited growing up in California. These woods feel ancient and watchful, in a way that's hard to explain to outsiders. My name is Daniel Morgan, and I moved to the small town of Eastwick Falls 6 months ago after landing a job as the environmental science teacher at the local high school. The position came with a charming, if somewhat isolated, cabin-style house on the edge of the Berkshires, a steal at the price. Now I understand why it was so affordable. The trouble started about 3 weeks after I moved in. Small things at first. Items around my house would move when I wasn't looking. My car keys would disappear from the hook by the door, only to turn up in the refrigerator. My hiking boots would be muddy in the morning, despite being clean when I went to bed. I blamed stress and exhaustion from the new job, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, in late September, I woke to the sound of laughter outside my bedroom window. Not the boisterous laughter of teenagers or the warm chuckle of adults. This was different. It was high-pitched and musical, but with an unsettling, almost mocking tone that made my skin crawl. I convinced myself it was just coyotes or some strange nocturnal bird. The next morning, I found small, humanoid footprints in the soft earth beneath my window. They were no larger than a child's hand, with 5 distinct toes, but something about their shape was wrong. The proportions were off, as if whatever made them walked differently than humans. I told myself they were raccoon tracks, distorted by the morning dew. That weekend, I decided to explore the woods behind my property. As a science teacher, I wanted to collect samples of local flora for my classroom. The forest was particularly beautiful that day. Sunlight filtered through the golden red October foliage, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. The earthy smell of decomposing leaves filled the air, and a light breeze carried the distant scent of pine. I followed a barely visible trail deeper into the woods. About a mile in, I encountered a circle of unusually shaped stones arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The stones were covered in a thick layer of moss, indicating they had been there for many years. At the center of the circle stood a single twisted oak tree that appeared significantly older than the surrounding forest. Something about the scene made me uneasy. I approached the circle, driven by scientific curiosity. As I stepped between 2 of the stones, the forest went completely silent. The birdsong that had accompanied my hike suddenly ceased. The rustling of leaves stopped, despite the continuing breeze I could feel on my skin. It was as if I had stepped into a vacuum. A cold feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small figure darting between trees about 50 yards away. It moved with unnatural quickness, its form blurry in the dappled light. It appeared to be about 3 feet tall with grayish skin that blended with the tree bark. Before I could get a better look, it vanished into the underbrush. I hurried back along the trail, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, small shadows flitting between trees, always just out of focus. The sound of twigs snapping seemed to come from all directions, despite there being no wind. When I finally reached my backyard, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The feeling lasted exactly 3 seconds, until I saw the state of my house. Every window was open. Not just unlocked, but wide open, the curtains billowing gently in the afternoon breeze. I distinctly remembered closing and locking everything before my hike. With trembling hands, I entered my home. Nothing appeared to be missing, but everything was slightly out of place. Books tilted at odd angles on the shelves. Chairs pulled an inch or 2 from the table. Picture frames rotated just enough to be noticeable. It was as if someone had rearranged every object in my house by the smallest possible degree, just enough to make me question my sanity. That night, I contacted Jim Blackwood, a colleague from the high school who had grown up in the area. We met at the local diner, the Rusty Spoon, a quintessential small-town establishment with vinyl booths and the perpetual smell of coffee and apple pie. "Those woods have always been strange," Jim said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "The old-timers called that area Whispering Pines, though there's not a single pine tree there. It's all oak and maple." When I described what I'd seen, Jim's expression grew serious. "Sounds like you've met our local Pukwudgies," he said, lowering his voice despite the nearly empty diner. "Puka what?" I asked, certain I'd misheard him. "Pukwudgies," Jim repeated. "They're from Wampanoag folklore, the tribe that lived in this region before European settlement. Think of them as forest spirits, but not the friendly kind. They're tricksters at best, dangerous at worst. According to Jim, the Pukwudgies were small, humanoid creatures that inhabited the forests of the northeastern United States, particularly in Massachusetts. They were known for playing tricks on humans, leading them astray in the woods, and occasionally causing more serious harm. My grandfather used to tell stories about them, Jim continued. He said they were once friendly with humans until something happened, some betrayal or disagreement, that turned them bitter. Now they mostly want to be left alone, but they'll mess with anyone who disturbs their territory. I laughed nervously, trying to rationalize. So, you're saying my house is being haunted by Native American forest goblins? Come on, Jim. Jim didn't laugh. I'm just telling you what the stories say. Whether you believe them or not is up to you. But around here, people don't mess with that part of the forest, especially after dark. He recommended I visit the local historical society if I wanted to learn more. Martha Whitehall runs the place. She knows all the local legends and has some books on indigenous folklore that might help. The next day, after school, I took Jim's advice and drove to the Eastwick Falls Historical Society, a converted Victorian house near the town square. Martha Whitehall was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town historian. A sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. When I mentioned the Pukwudgies, her eyes lit up with interest. Not many newcomers ask about them, she said, leading me to a bookshelf in the back room. Most people just want to know about the Revolutionary War sites or the old mill. Martha pulled out several books on local folklore and Native American legends. The Wampanoag believed the Pukwudgies were created by their creator god, Moshup, to help the people. But they became too proud and turned against humans, she explained. According to the literature, Pukwudgies possessed several supernatural abilities. They could appear and disappear at will, transform into various animals, particularly porcupines, control the weather on a small scale, and create fire. They were also said to lure humans deep into the forest, where they would become hopelessly lost. The most dangerous thing about them is their poisoned arrows, Martha said, showing me an old illustration, and their ability to push people off cliffs, though I suspect that part of the legend came from people getting lost and having accidents in the woods. I spent hours reading through Martha's collection. The most disturbing accounts described people who had encountered Pukwudgies experiencing ongoing harassment, missing items, strange noises at night, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. It sounded uncomfortably familiar. As I was leaving, Martha touched my arm gently. If you don't mind me asking, why the interest in Pukwudgies? I hesitated, then told her about my experiences. I expected skepticism, but Martha nodded, as if my story confirmed something she already knew. Your house is near the old stone circle, isn't it? She asked. When I nodded, she sighed. That area has always been associated with strange occurrences. The indigenous people considered it sacred ground, possibly a boundary between our world and the spirit world. Before I left, Martha gave me a small pouch of herbs, sweetgrass and sage. The Wampanoag use them for protection against harmful spirits. I'm not saying it will help, but it can't hurt. I thanked her, trying not to show how desperate I was for any solution, no matter how superstitious. That night, following Martha's instructions, I burned the herbs in a small clay bowl, letting the smoke fill each room of my house. The sweet, earthy aroma was oddly comforting. For 3 days, nothing unusual happened. No missing items, no strange noises, no footprints under my window. I began to relax, convinced that my imagination had gotten the better of me. Then came the 4th night. I awoke at exactly 3:17 a.m., according to my bedside clock. The house was unnaturally cold despite the heating system running. My breath fogged in the darkened bedroom, but that wasn't what had awakened me. Standing at the foot of my bed was a small figure, no taller than 3 feet. In the dim light filtering through my curtains, I could make out grayish skin, a disproportionately large head, and eyes that reflected light like a cat's. 2 pinpricks of silver in the darkness. I lay paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The figure tilted its head, studying me with obvious curiosity. Then, slowly, its mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide for its face, revealing pointed teeth. It raised one long-fingered hand and pressed it to its lips in a universal gesture for silence. Then it turned and glided, to my bedroom door, passing through the solid wood as if it were mist. The moment it disappeared, I could move again. I scrambled out of bed and turned on every light in the house. I searched each room but found nothing. The doors and windows were still locked, the sage still sitting in its bowl on the kitchen counter. Had I dreamed it? A vivid nightmare brought on by the stories I'd been reading. I almost convinced myself until I noticed the small, damp footprints leading from my bedroom to the back door. They weren't water. The liquid had a greenish tint and smelled of moss and rotting leaves. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn finally came, I called in sick to work and drove to the local library to use their internet connection, my own having mysteriously stopped working the day before. I spent hours researching Pukwudgie encounters and possible ways to deal with them. Most accounts were clearly sensationalized, but a few seemed credible. One consistent theme was that Pukwudgies were territorial and became hostile when they felt their domain was threatened. With growing unease, I realized that my house likely stood on what had once been Pukwudgie territory. The stone circle I'd found was probably significant to them in some way. By moving into the house and then entering the circle, I had inadvertently challenged their claim to the land. That afternoon, I spoke with an anthropology professor from the university in the neighboring town. Dr. Elena Ramirez specialized in indigenous cultures of New England. While she approached the subject from an academic perspective, she didn't dismiss the legends outright. Many indigenous oral traditions contain valuable information about the natural world and human psychology, she explained over coffee. The Pukwudgie stories might be a way of explaining territorial conflicts between different groups, or warnings about the dangers of certain areas in the forest. But when I described my experiences, her scientific detachment wavered. I've heard similar accounts from others in this region, she admitted. Too many to be coincidence or mass hysteria. Dr. Ramirez suggested that if I chose to believe the legends, I should try to make peace with the Pukwudgies. In most indigenous traditions, respect is paramount. If you've inadvertently trespassed, an offering and an apology might help. Following her advice, I collected items that the legends suggested Pukwudgies valued: berries, shiny objects, and tobacco. That evening, just as the sun was setting, I returned to the stone circle in the woods. The forest felt different this time. The usual ambient sounds were present: birdsong, rustling leaves, distant running water. But there was an underlying tension, as if the woods were holding their breath in anticipation. I placed my offerings in the center of the circle, beside the twisted oak. "I mean no disrespect," I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but desperate enough to try anything. "I apologize for intruding on your territory. I seek peace between us." As I spoke, the sunlight faded completely, leaving me in near darkness. A cool mist began rising from the ground, swirling around the stones. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the hair on my arms stood on end. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. Then another, and another. Small, shadowy figures moving just at the edge of visibility, circling me like wolves sizing up their prey. Heart pounding, I forced myself to remain still. "I am not your enemy," I continued, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I respect this land and its original inhabitants. I ask for permission to live here in harmony." The mist thickened and the shapes drew closer. I could make out details now. The elongated limbs, the oversized heads, the unnaturally wide mouths. There were at least 7 of them, maybe more, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. One figure, slightly larger than the others, stepped forward. Its eyes reflected the faint moonlight as it studied me, head tilted in that same curious gesture I'd seen in my bedroom. It held something in its hand, a small, crude bow with an arrow nocked and ready. I closed my eyes, certain I was about to feel the sting of a poisoned arrow. Instead, I heard a soft thud as something dropped at my feet. I opened my eyes to find a small object made of woven grass and twigs resting atop my offerings. It was a crude representation of a house, my house, with a small humanoid figure standing beside it. The message seemed clear enough. They were acknowledging my presence, perhaps even accepting my right to live there. The larger Pukwudgie nodded once, then stepped backward into the mist. One by one, the others followed, melting into the darkness until I was alone in the stone circle. I picked up the small effigy with trembling hands. It was intricately crafted, the tiny twigs bound together with some kind of natural fiber. The figure beside the house had a small tuft of what looked like my own hair. The walk back to my house was eerily peaceful. No strange sounds followed me, no glimpses of movement in the underbrush. For the first time since moving in, I felt as if the forest was simply a forest, not a sentient entity watching my every move. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the effigy was sitting on my nightstand, though I distinctly remembered placing it on the kitchen counter before bed. Beside it lay a small, smooth stone with unusual markings that resembled some kind of script. In the months that followed, life settled into a strange new normal. The Pukwudgies didn't leave. I would occasionally glimpse them at the edge of the woods, or hear their distinctive laughter at night. But the hostile activity ceased. My belongings stayed where I put them. No more footprints appeared beneath my windows. No more visits in the dead of night. Instead, I would sometimes find small gifts left on my porch. Interesting stones, unusual feathers, once even a perfectly preserved butterfly in a frame of twigs. In return, I would leave offerings at the stone circle, fresh berries, shiny coins, small trinkets that caught my eye. I became something of an amateur folklorist, documenting my experiences and researching similar accounts throughout New England. I learned that what happened to me was rare but not unique. Others had reported encounters with Pukwudgies, though few had reached the kind of détente I had established. Most people who encountered them experienced only the malevolent aspect, the tricks, the missing items, the sense of being watched and followed. Those who pushed further, who tried to document or confront the creatures, often reported escalating hostility, culminating in accidents or illness. What made the difference in my case? Perhaps it was the respect I showed. Perhaps it was my willingness to acknowledge their claim to the land. Or perhaps it was simple luck, catching them in a moment when they were inclined toward curiosity rather than animosity. Winter has come to Eastwick Falls now. Snow blankets the forest, transforming the landscape into a monochrome wonderland. The stone circle is hidden beneath drifts of white, the twisted oak a skeleton against the gray sky. The Pukwudgies are less active in the cold months, but I know they're still there. Sometimes, on particularly still nights, I hear their whispers carried on the wind. Sometimes I find tiny footprints in the snow leading to and from my house. Last week, during a heavy snowstorm, I woke to find my fireplace lit, though I had extinguished it before bed. Sitting before the crackling flames was a small gray figure, warming its elongated hands. It turned to look at me, its cat-like eyes reflecting the firelight, and nodded once before disappearing into the shadows. I've come to understand that the Pukwudgies aren't evil, despite what some of the legends claim. They're territorial and proud, yes. They're capable of malice when provoked, but they're also curious, intelligent, and in their own way, honorable. They respect boundaries once those boundaries are properly established. What makes them truly terrifying isn't their appearance or their abilities. It's the reminder they provide that we humans aren't the only intelligent beings claiming this land. We've built our cities and towns, paved over forests and fields, convinced ourselves that we're the undisputed masters of this continent. The Pukwudgies remind us that America had inhabitants long before Europeans arrived. Some of those inhabitants weren't human, and they're still here, watching from the woods, reminding us of a simple truth. This land was never truly ours to begin with. If you find yourself walking in the forests of New England, particularly in Massachusetts, and feel that distinctive prickling on the back of your neck, if you notice small items going missing, or hear high-pitched laughter when no one is around, if you glimpse small, gray figures darting between trees at the edge of your vision, you might be in Pukwudgie territory. Show respect. Leave a small offering. Acknowledge their presence and their right to be there. And perhaps, like me, you'll find not an enemy, but an unusual neighbor in the watching woods. I still live in my house on the edge of the Berkshires. I still teach science at the local high school. Life goes on, outwardly normal, but I'm changed by what I've experienced. I see the world differently now, more aware of its mysteries and ancient presences. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I sit on my porch and watch the forest. I know they're watching back, and in that mutual awareness, that respectful distance, we found an unusual peace. So, the next time you're hiking and get that feeling that you're not alone, maybe you're not. Maybe the Pukwudgies are watching you, deciding whether you're a threat or merely a visitor passing through their domain. What happens next might depend entirely on how you respond. Do you believe in Pukwudgies now? Have you ever experienced something in the woods you couldn't explain? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of New England's mysterious forest dwellers, please like and subscribe for more explorations of America's forgotten folklore. Sleep well tonight, and maybe check under your bed before you do. Those small footprints might not be from your cat after all. Story number 3. Hey there, night owls and thrill seekers. Before we dive into tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable. Pull those blankets up close, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for something that still haunts me to this day. Something that changed how I see reality itself. If you enjoy this journey into the darker corners of my mind, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your theories about what really happened might just help me make sense of it all. Because even now, months later, I'm not sure I've escaped. And now, the story begins. Have you ever felt like you're being watched? Not just the casual glance of a stranger, but truly observed, studied. That's how it started for me, with a feeling. Just a small nagging sensation at the back of my neck. I'm Rachel Turner, 32, living in a small town just outside of Portland, Maine. I work as a freelance graphic designer, spend too much time on social media, and have a cat named Gatsby who judges my life choices daily. Normal stuff. My life was comfortable until what happened last October. The air had that distinct fall crispness to it. I had just finished a major project for a client in Boston and decided to treat myself to a weekend getaway at a quaint bed and breakfast. Wildwood Inn, nestled between mountains and seemingly forgotten by time. The inn looked picture-perfect, like something from a New England postcard. 3 stories of Victorian charm, complete with a wraparound porch and gingerbread trim. Wind chimes tinkled gently. A rocking chair swayed slightly, though no one sat in it. Just the wind, I told myself. The innkeeper, Martha, greeted me with grandmother-like warmth. Rosy cheeks, silver hair pulled into a loose bun, flour dusting her apron. "You must be Rachel. We've been expecting you," she said, her smile reaching her eyes, which were a striking pale blue, almost too pale. Room 7 is all ready for you, dear. Top floor, end of the hall, best view in the house. Martha handed me an actual metal key attached to a heavy brass number. Dinner's at 6. Don't be late. The others are dying to meet you. Others? I hadn't realized there would be a communal dinner. Something about the way she said dying to meet you sent a shiver down my spine. The hallway to my room was lined with black and white photographs. Families, couples, individuals, all posed in front of the inn. I paused at one from what looked like the 1950s. A family of 4 standing stiffly, the parents smiling, the children not. Something about their eyes. They seemed to follow me. Room 7 was elegant and slightly overwhelming. Floral wallpaper, 4-poster bed, antique dresser with a mirror, and the view. A panorama of dense forest stretching toward mountains. On the dresser sat a small welcome basket with fresh-baked cookies, a handwritten note, and a curious little box made of dark wood with intricate carvings. Symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to shift slightly under my gaze. I set it back down, suddenly feeling like it was watching me somehow. The grandfather clock chimed 5 times. An hour until dinner. As I turned toward the bathroom, something caught my eye in the mirror. For just a split second, I could have sworn I saw someone behind me. I whipped around. Empty room. Of course. When I made my way downstairs at 6, the dining room was already filled with other guests. 5 of them, seated around a large oak table, turning to look at me simultaneously. "Ah, here she is," Martha announced. "Everyone, this is Rachel, our final guest for the weekend." The others introduced themselves. David, a professor type with salt and pepper hair. Karen and Tom, a couple in their 60s. Emma, a young woman with a camera. And Michael, absorbed in his phone until David cleared his throat. "So, what brings you to Wildwood?" Karen asked as Martha served dinner. "Just needed a break from work," I replied. "What about all of you?" They exchanged glances. "Oh, we're regulars," David finally said. "Come every year for the festival." "Festival?" I asked. "The Autumn Mind Festival," Emma explained. "That's why you got the puzzle box in your room." "The wooden box? It's a puzzle?" "It's part of the weekend," Tom explained. "Each guest receives one. Solving it is important." "Very important," Martha added. "The festival can't begin until all puzzles are solved." Throughout dinner, they would pause mid-sentence, as if listening for something. Their eyes would dart to the windows. They kept refilling my wine glass. By dessert, I felt lightheaded. "I think I should turn in early," I said. "Sleep well, Rachel," Martha said. "Remember, the festival begins at dawn. Best solve that puzzle tonight." In my room, I examined the puzzle box again. The carvings seemed to shift under my gaze. After several frustrated attempts, I set it down and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, my dreams were filled with whispers and watching eyes. I woke with a start. The puzzle box sat on my chest, and it was open. Inside was a small slip of paper with a single word: participate. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times. Dawn. The festival was beginning. I dressed quickly and tucked the note into my pocket. The hallway was silent. The dining room empty. The front door stood slightly ajar. Outside, a light mist hung over the grounds. Figures stood at the edge of the forest, the other guests, waiting for me. David stepped forward. "You solved it. Excellent. We can begin." "Begin what?" I asked, wrapping my arms against the morning chill. "A test of perception," Emma said. "A game. A mind game," Michael added. "The most important one you'll ever play." David gestured toward a path into the woods. "Shall we?" I hesitated. 5 strangers leading me into the forest at dawn. Every horror movie flashed through my mind. Yet, I followed. The word from the puzzle box seemed to pulse in my pocket. Participate. After 20 minutes, we reached a clearing with a stone table carved with the same symbols from the puzzle box. 6 stone seats surrounded it. "Take your place, Rachel," Martha said from behind me. "The 6th seat has been waiting for you." They all watched as I slowly approached the table. The stone seat was cold through my jeans as I sat down. The others took their places, Martha standing behind David like some kind of sentinel. "The rules are simple," David began, his voice taking on a formal quality. "Each of us will share a story, a memory, a secret, a fear. The others will ask questions. The goal is to determine what's real and what isn't." "Like 2 truths and a lie?" I asked, relieved. This seemed innocuous enough. Karen chuckled, the sound hollow and without humor. "More like 6 truths and a nightmare. In each round, someone will share something true about themselves, but with one fabricated element designed to mislead. We must identify the falsehood." "And if we can't?" I asked. "Then the falsehood becomes truth," Michael said simply, as if that explained everything. Before I could ask what that meant, David continued, "I'll begin. When I was 10 years old, I found a door in the woods behind my house in Michigan. It wasn't attached to anything, just a freestanding door frame with a red door. I opened it, stepped through, and found myself in the same forest, but different, darker. The air smelled like copper. I spent what felt like hours there before finding the door again and returning home. When I got back, 3 days had passed, and a search party was looking for me. I never told anyone where I'd been, and sometimes I still dream of what was watching me from between the trees in that other place." Silence fell over the table. I waited for someone to challenge his story, to point out the obvious fabrication, but the others were looking at me expectantly. Is it my turn to guess the lie?" I asked. "You're the guest of honor," Tom said. "You get the first attempt in each round." I considered David's story, a door in the woods, time passing differently, something watching him. It all sounded impossible. The lie is, the door was red, I guessed, figuring it had to be some small detail. Martha made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, disappointed. "Not correct," David said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Karen, your turn." Karen suggested the lie was about Michigan, that it had happened in Wisconsin instead. Emma thought he hadn't actually stepped through the door. Tom believed David had told someone about his experience, contrary to his claim. Michael suggested the search party was the fabrication. After each guess, David simply shook his head. The lie, he finally revealed, was that I found my way back through the door. Something else came back instead. A chill ran down my spine as the others nodded, as if this made perfect sense. David's eyes seemed to change as he stared at me, the pupils expanding until they nearly swallowed the iris. "Your turn, Rachel," he said, his voice slightly different now, hollow, echoing. I don't understand," I stammered. "What is this really about?" "The game," Emma said, leaning forward. "It's your turn to share, truth with one lie." My mind raced. This was bizarre, unsettling, and yet I found myself playing along. When I was in college, I had a roommate named Lily. We were close, best friends. One night, she went out to a party and never came back. They found her car the next day parked near the lake, but no sign of her. For weeks, I had dreams where she was trying to tell me something, standing at the foot of my bed, soaking wet, pointing toward the window. After the third dream, I went to the lake at night and found her student ID card half buried in the sand. I never told the police. Sometimes, I still feel like I failed her. The story had poured out of me a mixture of truth and fiction that I hadn't planned. Lily had been my roommate, but she was alive and well, living in Chicago last I checked. The rest? Where had that come from? "The lie," Karen said immediately. is that you never told the police about the ID card. You did tell them." "No," I said, confused by her certainty. "The lie is that Lily disappeared. She's fine. We just lost touch after college. We're Facebook friends. She works for a marketing agency in Chicago." And the five of them exchanged glances again, that silent communication passing between them. "Interesting," Martha murmured from her position behind David. "Very interesting." "You believe that's the lie?" David asked, his enlarged pupils fixed on me. "It's not a belief," I said, growing frustrated. "It's a fact. I made up the disappearance. Lily is fine." "Check your phone," Michael suggested, his voice oddly gentle now. Frowning, I pulled out my cell phone. No service, as expected this deep in the woods. But I opened my photo gallery, scrolling to college pictures. Lily and I at graduation. Lily and I at a concert. Lily and I. The pictures were there, but Lily wasn't. In each photo, I stood alone or with a blurry shape where she should have been. My hands began to shake. This isn't right. You've done something to my phone." "We haven't touched your phone, Rachel," Emma said softly. "This is why we're here, to separate truth from fabrication, memory from revision." "What's happening to me?" I whispered, looking from face to face, finding no comfort in their solemn expressions. "The game continues," David said, ignoring my question. "Karen's turn." As Karen began her story, something about a childhood pet that spoke to her, I felt the world tilting again, just as it had at dinner. The trees around the clearing seemed to bend inward, watching, listening. The stone beneath me pulsed like a heartbeat. This wasn't a quaint local tradition. This wasn't a simple mind game. This was something else entirely. And somehow, I was at the center of it all. Karen's childhood pet. A cat that supposedly spoke prophecies. The lie? It wasn't a cat, but a bird. Emma's recurring dream of a house she'd never visited, where each room contained younger versions of herself. The lie? In the dream, she couldn't tell which version was real. Tom's confession about a twin brother who had died at birth, but whose voice he still heard whispering from drains and heating vents. The lie? The brother hadn't died at birth, but had been absorbed in the womb. Michael's account of waking up one morning to find his reflection performing actions independent of his movements. The lie? It wasn't his reflection, but his shadow. With each round, I felt increasingly disoriented. The clearing seemed to shift and breathe around us. The symbols on the stone table glowed faintly, then more intensely as the game progressed. And with each story, with each revelation, memories I'd thought were solid began to waver and change in my mind. I don't know how long we sat there, hours maybe. The sun arced overhead and began its descent, though the light in the clearing remained strangely constant. My stomach growled, but no one suggested a break for food. My throat was dry, but no one offered water. It was as if basic physical needs had been suspended for the duration of the game. Throughout it all, Martha stood silent and watchful behind David, her pale blue eyes taking in everything. She never sat, never spoke except to make that disappointed clicking sound when someone guessed incorrectly. After Michael's round, all eyes turned to me again. "One more from each of us," David explained. "Then the final phase begins." Final phase? My heart skipped a beat at the implication. I hadn't agreed to any of this, yet here I was, unable to break away from whatever strange spell had been cast over this gathering. I cleared my throat, deciding to test the boundaries of this game. Since I was a child, I've had this recurring dream where I'm staying at an old inn. There are 5 other guests, and they convince me to play a mind game in the woods. With each round, I lose more of myself, until I can't tell what's real and what isn't. The lie is that it's a dream at all. This is happening right now, isn't it? And you're not just fellow guests, you're something else. Silence fell over the table. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. David's face split into a wide smile, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous. too sharp. "Very good, Rachel, very good indeed." The others nodded, their expressions a mixture of approval and what almost looked like relief. "So, what is this really?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. "What are you?" "Guardians," Karen said. "Gatekeepers," Tom added. "Witnesses," from Emma. "Participants, just like you," Michael finished. David leaned forward, his two large pupils reflecting the symbols now glowing vibrantly on the table's surface. "We are the game, Rachel. And the game is us. As for what this is," he gestured around at the clearing, the forest, the sky. "This is a threshold, a place between places." "I don't understand," I said, though part of me feared that I was beginning to. Martha spoke for the first time since we'd entered the clearing. "Every 50 years the veil between realities thins in this place. The wildwood becomes a crossroads of possibility. What was, what is, what could be, all flowing together. And that matters because," I prompted. "Because someone must maintain the boundaries," David explained. "Someone must decide which version of reality continues forward. That's the purpose of the game, to determine who has the strongest grip on their own truth." "You're saying this is some kind of reality competition?" The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, despite the growing dread in my stomach. "In a manner of speaking," Karen nodded. "Though competition suggests there can be multiple winners." The implication hung in the air between us. "Only one version of reality can proceed," David confirmed. "Only one set of memories can be true when the sun rises tomorrow." I looked at each of them in turn, these 5 strangers who suddenly felt terrifyingly familiar. And the others. "Become like us," Michael said quietly. "Guardians of the threshold until the next cycle." "For 50 years, I whispered. Martha's hand came to rest on my shoulder, her touch like ice through my sweater. "Time moves differently here, dear. You already know that. 50 years, or an eternity, it depends on your perspective." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "And if I refuse to keep playing, if I just walk away right now?" "You solved the puzzle box," Emma said simply. "You said participate. There's no walking away now." As if to emphasize her point, I noticed for the first time that the clearing was now completely encircled by fog, thick and impenetrable. The path we had followed was gone. "The final phase," David announced, standing from his stone seat. The others rose as well, and I found myself doing the same, though I hadn't consciously decided to. "Now we determine whose reality persists." They began to walk toward the center of the table, which I now saw had a circular depression in its middle, like a shallow bowl. Each placed their right hand into this depression, palms down, fingers spread. Martha nudged me forward. "Your place is here, Rachel, among us." My feet moved against my will, carrying me to the table's center. My right hand raised itself, hovering over the depression where the 5 others had placed theirs. The symbols on the table were now pulsing, synchronizing with my heartbeat. "What happens when I place my hand there?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "The judging begins," David said. "The game reveals who has maintained the strongest connection to their true self, to their authentic memories and experiences. That reality becomes dominant. And the rest of us? We become what? Trapped here?" "Not trapped," Karen corrected gently, "transformed. You become a guardian of the threshold, helping to maintain the boundaries between what is and what might have been. For how long? Until you're replaced," Tom said. "In the next cycle. 50 years, half a century of what? Existing in this in-between place, guiding other unwitting travelers through this same twisted game." My hand trembled above theirs. I could feel a pull like magnetism, drawing my palm downward. "There must be another way," I said desperately. "This can't be the only option." Something flickered across David's face. Was it doubt? Hope? It was gone too quickly to identify. "There is no other way," Martha said firmly from behind me. "The game must be completed. The cycle must continue. Place your hand, Rachel." The pull grew stronger. My arm ached with the effort of resistance. Inches from the other's hands, my fingers began to tingle, as if electricity was arcing between us. In that moment, clarity struck me like lightning. Throughout the game, they had all been so certain of the rules, of the process, of the inevitable outcome. Too certain, as if they had done this before, as if this script had played out time and again. But I wasn't part of their script. I was Rachel Turner, 32, freelance graphic designer with an ornery cat and a life waiting for me beyond these woods. This was my story, not theirs. "No," I said, the word carrying more power than I expected. I pulled my hand back with tremendous effort, clutching it to my chest. "I reject your game. I reject your rules." The symbols on the table flared blindingly bright. The ground beneath us shuddered. "You can't," Emma gasped, genuine fear in her eyes for the first time. "The game must be completed. The threshold must be maintained." "Says who?" I challenged, taking a step back. "Who made these rules? Who decided this is how it has to be?" They looked at each other, confusion evident on their faces. Had no one ever questioned this before? "It's tradition," Martha said, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. "It's how it's always been." "Well, I'm changing the tradition," I declared. "I choose my own reality. I choose to remember my life as it was. Boring, normal, with a cat who judges me and a roommate named Lily who's alive and well in Chicago. I choose to walk out of these woods and drive home and forget this place ever existed." The clearing rippled around us, like heat waves rising from pavement. The others cried out in alarm, their hands still locked in place on the stone table. "You'll doom us all," David warned, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. The threshold. Without the game, without the choice. "Maybe it's time for a new choice," I suggested. "Maybe it's time to question why this cycle has to continue at all." The fog at the edge of the clearing began to swirl and thin in places. Through one such gap, I could see the path we had followed. I took another step back, then another. None of them moved to stop me, their hands seemingly glued to the stone. "Rachel, wait," Michael called, desperation in his voice. "If you leave like this, we don't know what will happen. The threshold could collapse entirely. Or maybe it will reset," I suggested. "Maybe you'll all get to go home too." Hope and fear battled across their faces. Martha alone remained inscrutable. Her pale eyes narrowed as she watched me retreat. 50 years is long enough to be trapped in someone else's game, I said softly. Maybe it's time for all of you to find your way back to your own realities too. With that, I turned and ran for the gap in the fog, ignoring their shouts behind me. The path seemed to lengthen and twist as I sprinted, branches reaching for me like grasping hands. The forest itself seemed to be fighting my escape, roots rising to trip me, vines dropping from above. But I kept running, my lungs burning, focusing on one thought. This is my reality. This is my truth. I reject their game. Behind me, a sound like thunder rolled through the forest. The ground shook beneath my feet. A wind filled with whispers rushed past me, carrying what sounded like thousands of voices, all overlapping, all desperate to be heard. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, if I hesitated for even a moment, I would be pulled back into that clearing forever. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the trees thinned, and I burst out onto the manicured lawn of Wildwood Inn. It stood just as I remembered. Victorian elegance, wraparound porch, wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. Except, it looked abandoned. Paint peeling. Windows boarded up. The flower beds overgrown with weeds. It was as if years, not hours, had passed since I'd first arrived. My car still sat in the gravel driveway, a thin layer of dust covering it as if it had been there for weeks, not overnight. A spider had even begun to spin a web between the side mirror and the door. Moving on shaky legs, I made it to the driver's side and yanked the door open, half expecting it to be locked. The key was in the ignition where I never would have left it. The date on my phone read November 3rd, a full week after I'd arrived. With trembling hands, I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw 6 figures standing on the porch, watching me go. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but an empty, decaying house. The drive home was a blur. I kept the radio on full volume, as if the mundane chatter of DJs and the familiar pop songs could anchor me to reality. To my reality. Every few minutes, I checked my phone, scrolling through photos. Lily was in all of them just as she should be. Solid, present, real. When I finally reached my apartment, Gatsby greeted me with the indignant yowl of a cat who felt he'd been abandoned. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had been feeding him, she explained when I knocked on her door to thank her. The woman from the B&B called, she said, frowning slightly. Said you'd extended your stay but forgot to make arrangements for your cat. I was getting worried when you didn't answer your phone. What woman? I thought about asking, but something stopped me. Instead, I thanked her again and retreated to my apartment, double-locking the door behind me. That night, I sat cross-legged on my bed, Gatsby purring beside me, and called Lily. We hadn't spoken in months, but she answered on the 3rd ring, her voice exactly as I remembered. Rachel, is everything okay? I nearly wept at the sound. Yeah, just wanted to check in. How are you? We talked for an hour about nothing important. Her job, her new apartment, the guy she'd started dating, normal stuff, real stuff. With every word she spoke, every laugh we shared, reality seemed to solidify around me again. After we hung up, I spent hours researching Wildwood Inn online. There was no website, no reviews, no record it had ever existed. The only hit was a brief mention in a local historical society's archive, Wildwood Lodge, destroyed by fire in 1972. 5 occupants perished. The article included a grainy black and white photo of the inn in its prime. On the porch stood a family of 4, parents and 2 children, and a woman I recognized instantly as Martha, looking exactly as she had when I met her. The caption dated the photo to 1954. I've spent months trying to make sense of what happened, trying to convince myself it was some kind of elaborate hoax or hallucination. But deep down, I know better. Sometimes, when I'm between sleep and waking, I hear whispers from the heating vent in my bedroom. Sometimes, my reflection hesitates a fraction of a second too long before mirroring my movements. Sometimes, I dream of a stone table in a forest clearing, where 5 people wait for a 6th to join their game. And sometimes, like right now, as I tell you this story, I wonder if I truly escaped at all. Or if this reality is just another version of the game, playing out on a larger scale. If somewhere Martha is standing behind me, watching with those pale blue eyes, waiting for me to place my hand on the table and make my final choice. But I've made my choice already. This is my reality. This is my truth. And no mind game, no matter how elaborate, will make me doubt it again. Or at least, that's what I keep telling myself. So, there you have it, my midnight companions. The worst mind game of my life. Or perhaps just the beginning of an even more complex one. What do you think? Did I truly escape? Or am I still playing by their rules without realizing it? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this glimpse into my nightmare, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the edges of reality. The line between what's real and what isn't might be thinner than any of us realize, and I'm still trying to figure out which side I'm on. Sweet dreams, if you can trust them. Story number 4. Have you ever felt that strange sensation that someone or something is watching you? Maybe while hiking through dense woods or driving alone on a remote mountain road. That feeling when the hair on your arms stands up and your breath catches in your throat. What if I told you those instincts might be trying to warn you about something ancient that lurks in certain remote places across America? Something that doesn't want to be seen, but sometimes needs to be fed. I'm about to share a story that was passed down to me by my grandfather, who heard it from his father before him. A story about the small town of Pinecrest, nestled in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. If you ever find yourself driving through a mountain pass as the sun begins to set, you might want to remember this tale. But before we begin, make sure you're comfortable, because once you know about the giant, you might start sensing it too. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales from America's Forgotten Corners. And please, share your own strange mountain experiences below. I have a feeling some of you might have encountered something similar without even realizing it. Now, let's begin our story. The sky was fading to a deep indigo as I guided my Jeep Cherokee along Highway 2, heading east through Stevens Pass in the Cascade Mountains. My dashboard clock read 8:17 p.m. Too late to be making this drive, especially in late October when darkness comes early to the mountains. But my cousin's wedding in Leavenworth wasn't something I could miss, and my deadline at the advertising firm in Seattle had kept me working until the last possible minute. Just an hour more, I muttered to myself, taking another sip of lukewarm gas station coffee. The radio had faded to static about 20 minutes back. These mountains had notorious dead zones. I switched it off, preferring the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional whisper of wind through the evergreens that loomed on either side of the highway. That's when I noticed the fog. It wasn't normal fog. This appeared suddenly, dense and localized, like someone had draped a white sheet across the road ahead. My headlights barely penetrated it. I eased off the accelerator, letting the Jeep slow to 40, then 30. The wall of fog seemed to pulse slightly, almost breathing. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What the hell?" I whispered, squinting through the windshield. As I entered the fog bank, the temperature inside my Jeep plummeted. The windows fogged instantly, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I reached to crank the heater higher, but it was already on full blast. My dashboard thermometer, which had shown 48 degrees moments before, now displayed 29 and dropping. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. I slowed to a crawl, desperately searching for the yellow line to guide me. The rational part of my brain said this was just a weird weather phenomenon, a temperature inversion or something, but deeper instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. That's when I heard it. A sound so deep it was more felt than heard. A vibration that made my coffee ripple in its cup and the windows of my Jeep resonate faintly. Thoom, a pause. Thoom, another pause. Thoom. It took my brain a moment to process what I was hearing. Footsteps. Massive, impossibly heavy footsteps. My throat constricted. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Construction equipment, an echo from a distant rock slide, or maybe just my imagination amplifying the sound of my Jeep's engine. But deep down, I knew those were footsteps, and they were getting closer. Thoom, thoom, thoom. The rhythm quickened slightly, and with each impact my Jeep trembled. I pressed harder on the gas, accelerating to a dangerous speed given the limited visibility. The yellow line disappeared and reappeared in my headlights, weaving like a snake. I was driving far too fast for these conditions, but panic had taken over. The fog thinned momentarily, and in my rearview mirror I caught a glimpse of something. A massive silhouette, more suggestion than clear shape, moving along the ridge above the highway. My mind couldn't process its scale. It seemed to be keeping pace with my speeding vehicle without apparent effort. Then the fog closed in again, thicker than before, and my Jeep's engine began to sputter. "No, no, no, not now," I pleaded, pumping the gas pedal. The engine coughed once, twice, and died. Momentum carried me forward another 100 feet before the Jeep rolled to a stop, directly in the center of the highway. I turned the key frantically, but the engine wouldn't even turn over, not even a click. Complete electrical failure. I sat there, hands shaking, as the silence enveloped me. No passing cars, no wind. Even the usual chorus of mountain insects had gone silent. Just the soft, settling noises of my cooling engine and thoom, thoom, thoom. The footsteps were closer now, much closer. And they were slowing down. I fumbled for my phone. No service, of course, but maybe the flashlight. A shadow passed over my Jeep, blotting out what little ambient light remained. Something enormous was moving on the ridge directly above me, causing small stones and dirt to rain down on my roof. I froze, not even daring to breathe. The movement stopped. I sensed, rather than saw, something massive shifting its weight, settling into a crouch on the ridge, watching me. 1 minute passed, then 2. The silence was absolute except for my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Slowly, moving as little as possible, I reached for the door handle. If I could just get out and make it to the trees on the opposite side of the highway, maybe I could... A low vibration began to build, rattling the loose change in my cup holder. It rose in pitch until it became a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a hum, something ancient and utterly inhuman. It resonated through my body, setting my teeth on edge and making my skull ache. I snatched my hand back from the door. The sound stopped abruptly. Then something moved again. Not on the ridge this time, but on the road ahead. The fog swirled and parted momentarily, and I caught a glimpse of something pale and enormous crossing the highway about 50 yards ahead. Something that walked on 2 legs, but was far, far too large to be human. Then the fog closed again, and it was gone. I sat paralyzed, barely breathing, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump, my Jeep's engine roared to life. The headlights blazed, the radio blared static, and the heater pumped out hot air. The dashboard clock, which had frozen at 8:23 p.m., suddenly skipped ahead to 9:47 p.m. I'd lost over an hour somehow. Without questioning this strange mercy, I shoved the Jeep into drive and floored it. The fog seemed to resist for a moment, then peeled away like a curtain being drawn back. Clear night sky appeared above, stars cold and distant, indifferent to what had just happened. 20 minutes later, I pulled into Leavenworth, the Bavarian-themed town glowing with warm lights and weekend tourists. I parked in front of the lodge and sat there, engine idling, unable to make myself get out. Normal life seemed impossibly distant now. My phone chimed. Service had returned. A text from my cousin. "Where are you? We were getting worried." How could I possibly explain what had happened? I couldn't even explain it to myself. Instead, I texted back, "Sorry, got delayed by weird fog in the pass. I'm at the lodge now." As I pressed send, another text came through from an unknown number. "Did you see it too? Stevens Pass, October 1998. It watches from above. Call me." Followed by a phone number with a Seattle area code. I stared at the message, my blood running cold. I had never told anyone what had just happened, and how could someone know to text me about it? Unless they'd seen it too. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake in my hotel room, the events in the mountain pass replaying in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive silhouette moving along the ridge. Morning arrived with cheerful sunlight streaming through the curtains, making the previous night's terror seem almost dreamlike. Had I imagined it all? Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel briefly. Maybe the fog had triggered some kind of hallucination. But then there was that text message from the unknown number. After my cousin's wedding, which passed in a blur of forced smiles and distracted congratulations, I found myself sitting in my Jeep in the hotel parking lot, staring at my phone. The message was still there, real. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Miller speaking. Hi, I hesitated. You texted me last night? About Stevens Pass? A long pause. Then, where are you now? Leavenworth. I'm heading back to Seattle this afternoon. Not through the pass, I hope. My stomach tightened. It's the only way back. Listen carefully. His voice lowered. Don't drive that pass after 7 p.m. Ever. If you have to go through today, do it now. In daylight. And don't stop for anything. What was it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What did I see? The man, Miller, was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, become more formal, as if reciting something memorized. The local tribes called it Semequis, the night giant. Early settlers had other names, the Ridge Walker, the Mountain Watcher. Those of us who've encountered it just call it the giant. A giant? Like from fairy tales? Miller gave a humorless laugh. Nothing like fairy tales. This is something old, something that was here long before humans. It harvests occasionally, takes people. But mostly it just watches, stays hidden. That's why there's no concrete evidence, no clear photos. It doesn't want to be seen. And trust me, you don't want to see it either. A chill ran through me despite the warm car. But I did see it. Or at least, part of it. Then you're lucky to be alive. Most who get as close as you did don't make it out of the pass. He paused. Look, I've been researching this thing for 20 years, ever since my own encounter. I have a group, others who've seen it. We meet in Seattle. First Thursday of every month at the Timberline Cafe on Cherry Street. 8 p.m. If you want to know more, if you're having experiences, come find us. Experiences? What do you mean? Dreams. Sensations of being watched, unexplained noises. Once it notices you, it doesn't completely let go. Miller's voice had taken on an urgent quality. Just be careful. And remember, never drive that pass after dark again. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I checked the time, 1:30 p.m. Plenty of daylight left. Taking Miller's warning to heart, I started the Jeep and headed out, determined to get through Stevens Pass well before sunset. The drive was uneventful at first. Brilliant autumn colors lined the highway, reds and golds against the dark green of evergreens. Everything seemed so normal, so safe. But as I approached the section of highway where I'd encountered the fog the night before, a heaviness settled in my chest. The Jeep's engine seemed to labor slightly, despite the road being relatively flat. My hands grew clammy on the steering wheel. I was just about to pass the spot when something caught my eye. A trail of disturbed earth on the ridge above the highway. It looked as if something massive had dragged itself along the ridgeline, leaving a path of uprooted shrubs and displaced rocks in its wake. And there, at the edge of the ridge, partially hidden by pine trees, a cave opening. Not a natural formation, but something that looked almost dug out, as if enormous hands had clawed away the mountainside. I slowed the Jeep, mesmerized by the sight. Had that cave always been there? Had anyone else noticed it? A semi-truck blared its horn behind me, snapping me out of my trance. I was barely moving, causing a traffic backup. Shaking my head to clear it, I pressed the accelerator and drove on, the cave receding in my rearview mirror. By the time I reached Seattle, dusk was falling. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot with a profound sense of relief. Home. Safe. The mountain and its secrets left behind. Or so I thought. That night, the dreams began. I was walking along a mountain ridge, fog swirling around my ankles. Below me, tiny headlights moved along the highway like luminous insects. I knew I was dreaming, yet everything felt hyper-real. The rough stones beneath my feet, the bite of cold air, the smell of pine, and something else. Something earthy and ancient. I wasn't alone on the ridge. Something was behind me, following my every step. Something so large it blocked out the stars when I dared to glance back. A voice that wasn't a voice spoke directly into my mind. "You saw me." I tried to run, but my legs moved with the dream slowness. The presence behind me drew closer. "You weren't supposed to see me. Now you're part of this. Now you'll help me watch." I woke with a gasp, sheets tangled around me, body drenched in sweat. My bedroom was dark except for the red glow of my alarm clock. 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, my grandmother used to call it. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of something odd. My hands were filthy. Dirt caked under my fingernails, smeared across my palms, and beside my bed were my hiking boots, covered in mud and pine needles. But the most terrifying detail of all, my apartment was on the 3rd floor, and my window was wide open, curtains billowing in the night breeze. I lived 15 miles from the nearest mountain. The next days passed in a blur of growing dread. Each night the dreams returned, more vivid than the last. I was on the ridge, watching the highway below through eyes that didn't feel entirely my own. I was seeing what it saw, feeling its ancient hunger. And each morning, I'd wake to find evidence that these weren't just dreams. Dirt under my fingernails, scratches on my arms, my hiking boots muddied and worn. Somehow in the night I was going somewhere, or something was bringing me to it. I needed answers. I drove to the Seattle Public Library and spent hours researching local native legends about giants or mountain spirits, historical records of disappearances in the Cascade Mountains. What I found disturbed me deeply. Stevens Pass had an unusually high number of missing persons cases dating back to the 1880s. Most were attributed to avalanches, exposure, or hiking accidents. But reading between the lines, I noticed patterns. The disappearances clustered in 20-year cycles. They almost always occurred between dusk and dawn, and in many cases, vehicles were found abandoned in perfect working order, as if the drivers had simply stepped out into the night and vanished. That night, I took precautions. I locked my windows and doors. I wedged a chair under my bedroom doorknob. I even set up my phone to record video while I slept. None of it mattered. The dream came again, more vivid than before. I was on the ridge, but this time I wasn't walking. I was watching. Through eyes that felt oddly enhanced, I could see every car passing below on the highway. I could feel the vibrations of their engines through the stone beneath me. And I was hungry. So hungry. The presence was behind me again, massive and ancient, guiding my gaze to a particular car that had pulled over. A young couple, maps spread across their dashboard, arguing about directions. "Watch," the voice that wasn't a voice commanded. "Learn how I feed." I tried to resist, to turn away, to wake up. But I was locked in place, forced to witness what happened next. I won't describe it in detail. Some horrors shouldn't be shared. But the couple never saw what took them. One moment they were there, the next, collected, harvested. I woke up screaming, the taste of copper in my mouth. My phone had stopped recording at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time as the previous night. The chair was still wedged under my doorknob. My windows remained locked, but dirt smudged my sheets. Pine sap made my fingers sticky, and when I looked in the bathroom mirror, a small scratch ran across my cheek, as if a pine branch had whipped against my face. I couldn't wait any longer. I needed help now. I found Miller's number and called again. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" he said by way of greeting. "The dreams," I managed. "But they're not just dreams. I'm going somewhere. Or something is bringing me to it." Miller was quiet for a moment. "It's chosen you as a watcher. That's what it does. Finds human eyes to see through sometimes. Human minds to, I don't know, entertain it? Help it hunt? We're not sure, but it's escalating quickly with you. How do I make it stop?" My voice cracked with desperation. Meet me at Gasworks Park. 1 hour." He hung up. Miller wasn't hard to spot. A weathered man in his 60s with a silver beard and a flannel jacket, standing near the water's edge, staring across Lake Union at the Seattle skyline. "You look like hell," he said as I approached. "Feel worse," I replied. Miller nodded as if he'd expected this. "It's the connection. It drains you. What does it want from me? To use you, your eyes, your presence in places it can't easily go." He gestured toward the city. "It's bound to the mountains, but it's curious about us. You called it a night giant. What exactly is it?" Miller sighed heavily. "We have theories. Some think it's some kind of undiscovered species, a relic hominid that evolved differently. Others think it's something supernatural. Personally?" He turned to look directly at me. "I think it's both. Something physical enough to leave footprints, but ancient enough to have powers we can't comprehend. How do I break the connection? There is a way, but you won't like it." Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. The native tribes use these for protection. A mixture of herbs and minerals from the mountains themselves. You need to return to the place where you first saw it at the same time of night and leave this as an offering. A release. I stared at the pouch. "You want me to go back to Stevens Pass at night? It's the only way. The giant has rules it follows. If you formally reject the connection at the site of initial contact, it usually releases you." His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. "Usually." "And if it doesn't?" Miller didn't answer directly. "Thursday nights, Timberline Cafe. We help each other cope." I took the pouch. It felt heavier than its size suggested, and faintly warm. "Tonight," Miller said. "It has to be tonight. The connection grows stronger each day." As I turned to leave, Miller caught my arm. "One more thing. If you see it clearly, its full form, its face, don't look directly at it. Those who see its true appearance don't come back the same, if they come back at all." That warning echoed in my mind as I drove toward Stevens Pass that evening, the sun already sinking toward the jagged horizon of the Cascades. What was I doing? Driving directly toward the thing I should be fleeing? The rational part of my brain screamed that this was madness, that Miller was crazy, that I was experiencing some kind of mental break, sleepwalking, hallucinations, night terrors. Anything but the reality of an ancient giant that stalked mountain passes. But the dirt under my fingernails told a different story. As I approached the pass, the sun disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the highway into premature dusk. My Jeep's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the endless corridor of pine trees. The clock on my dashboard read 7:58 p.m. as I reached the approximate location of my first encounter. I pulled onto the narrow shoulder and turned off the engine. Silence descended, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine. The leather pouch sat heavy in my pocket as I stepped out of the Jeep. The October air bit at my exposed skin, but something else raised goosebumps on my arms. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked up at the ridge above the highway. In the fading light, I could just make out the cave opening I'd noticed days earlier. Had it grown larger? The darkness inside seemed absolute, a void cut into the mountainside. "I know you're there," I said, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the mountains. "I've brought something. A release." The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the trees with an almost musical moan. Pine needles swirled around my feet. I took the pouch from my pocket and held it up. "I reject this connection. I'm not your watcher. I don't want to see through your eyes." Nothing happened, just the wind and the deepening dark, and then a familiar vibration, a tremor that started in the ground beneath my feet and rose through my body. Thoom, thoom, thoom. The footsteps were coming from behind the ridge, drawing closer. The vibrations grew stronger until my teeth chattered and my vision blurred. Movement caught my eye. a massive shape rising from behind the ridge, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was impossibly tall, humanoid but wrong in its proportions. Long, long limbs. A head that seemed too small for its body, and it was climbing over the ridge, coming down toward the highway, coming for me. Miller's warning flashed in my mind: if you see its full form, its face, don't look directly at it. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps grew louder, closer, shaking the asphalt beneath my feet. The air pressure changed, as if something enormous had moved into my immediate vicinity, displacing the air around me. A scent enveloped me. Earth and stone and something older, something that reminded me of caves and deep places where sunlight never reaches. I reject the connection, I repeated, holding the pouch higher, eyes still tightly closed. Take this offering and release me. The pouch was plucked from my fingers, not roughly, but with a precision that suggested fingers far larger than human manipulating something very small with great care. Then came that sound again, not quite a growl, not quite a hum, vibrating through my body and setting my teeth on edge. But this time it almost felt like language, a communication I could almost understand. The pressure around me intensified. Something massive was bending down, bringing itself to my level. I could feel its presence inches from me, could sense its attention focused entirely on my small human form. Everything in me screamed to open my eyes, to finally see the thing that had haunted me, to know. Instead, I kept my eyes shut and whispered, "Please, let me go." The pressure withdrew suddenly. The vibration ceased. The scent of ancient earth receded. Thoom, thoom, thoom. The footsteps moved away, back toward the ridge, growing fainter with distance. Only when they had completely faded did I dare to open my eyes. The ridge stood dark against the night sky, empty. The cave entrance was gone, or hidden somehow, as if the mountainside had rearranged itself. My Jeep sat exactly where I'd left it, its metal surface covered in a fine layer of dust. I checked my phone. 9:47 p.m. Exactly the same time that had appeared on my dashboard clock after my first encounter, as if the giant had a specific way of marking these interactions. That night, I slept dreamlessly for the first time in days. I woke to clean hands and untouched hiking boots. No dirt in my bed. No taste of copper in my mouth. Was it over? Had the ritual worked? 3 months have passed since that night on Stevens Pass. Winter has settled over Seattle, bringing its usual gray skies and persistent drizzle. Life has returned to normal, or what passes for normal now. I go to work, meet friends for drinks, stream shows on weekends. But I haven't driven through any mountain passes since then, not even in daylight. I did attend one meeting at the Timberline Cafe 2 weeks after my final encounter with the giant. Miller was there, along with 7 others, all with the same haunted look in their eyes, all understanding what I'd experienced without needing explanations. They shared their own stories, encounters spanning decades. A forest ranger who'd seen something massive moving through trees during a midnight patrol in 1973. A truck driver who'd lost 3 hours on Stevens Pass in 2001 and woke up with strange symbols carved into his rig. All of them had rejected the connection using Miller's ritual. All had been released. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice something troubling. Despite their release, none of them seemed truly free. They spoke of occasional dreams, fleeting sensations of being watched, unexplained urges to drive toward the mountains at night. The giant's influence lingered like a psychic scar tissue. I never went back to another meeting. I told myself it was because I was one of the lucky ones, truly released, truly free. But deep down, I knew the real reason. I didn't want to become like them, defining my life around this experience. Winter turned to spring. The dreams didn't return. I convinced myself it was over. Then last week, something happened that shattered that illusion. I was grocery shopping in downtown Seattle when I noticed a tall man in the produce section. Very tall, well over 6.5 feet, with unusually long limbs and pale skin. He wore a dark coat despite the mild weather, and a hat pulled low over his face. Something about his movements caught my attention. They were fluid, but slightly off, as if he wasn't quite accustomed to his body, as if he were operating it rather than inhabiting it. Then he turned, as if sensing my attention, and looked directly at me from across the store. His eyes. God, his eyes. They were human in shape, but not in nature. Too deep, too knowing, filled with an intelligence that didn't belong in a human skull. For a split second, I thought I saw something else behind those eyes. Something massive and ancient, looking through this human vessel like a person might peer through a keyhole. Recognition flashed between us. The giant. Somehow walking in human form. A voice that wasn't a voice spoke directly into my mind. Did you think mountains were the only places I could watch from? I abandoned my cart and fled the store, heart pounding in my chest. I drove home in a daze, checking my rearview mirror at every stoplight. That night, I called Miller. "It can take human form?" I asked when he answered. Miller was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "Not exactly, but it can influence certain people, use them as vessels for brief periods, extensions of itself." But I rejected the connection. The ritual worked. Did it? Miller asked quietly. Or did it just change forms? After we hung up, I sat in my darkened apartment, watching the distant outline of the Cascade Mountains through my window. It was out there, watching. Sometimes from ridgelines above remote highways. Sometimes from behind human eyes in grocery stores. I find myself wondering how many strange disappearances across America might be attributed to it or things like it. How many missing hikers, vanished travelers, empty cars on lonely roads? How many ancient things might be hiding in plain sight, using human perception against us? I haven't seen the tall man again, but now, in crowds, I find myself studying people more carefully, looking for those slightly wrong movements, those too knowing eyes, those vessels that might contain something ancient and hungry walking among us. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still feel the connection, tenuous but present, like a thin thread stretching from my mind to something vast and patient in the mountains, waiting, always waiting. If you're listening to this story while driving through mountain passes, keep your eyes on the road. Don't look up at the ridgelines as dusk approaches, because once it notices you noticing it, the connection begins. And here's the most terrifying part. If you've made it to the end of this story, if you've truly listened and absorbed these words, you might already be connected. In sharing this tale, I may have inadvertently opened a door for you too. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck right now. That feeling of something massive shifting its attention toward you. That's not just your imagination. The giant knows stories about itself are being told. It listens for its name in the darkness. And now, it might be listening to you. Tonight, if you find yourself suddenly wide awake at precisely 3:17 a.m., if you notice dirt under your fingernails that wasn't there when you went to sleep, remember this story. Remember what I've told you, and maybe, just maybe, find your way to the Timberline Cafe on Cherry Street. First Thursday of the month, 8 p.m. Tell them you know about the giant that hides in the mountain pass. We'll be waiting. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that chill of recognition, please like and subscribe to hear more tales from America's Forgotten Corners. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Have you ever felt watched while traveling through mountain roads? The giant is watching. But now, you're watching back. Sleep tight, and remember to check your fingernails in the morning.